They say a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. But they never tell you what happens when the truth finally ties its laces and begins to walk. It doesn't run, you see. It walks, slowly, methodically, and it doesn't stop until it reaches its destination. For Dr. Eleanor Vance, a woman whose life was built on precision and fact, the truth was about to begin the longest journey of its life. The night it all began was like any other, marked by the quiet hum of a city settling into slumber. Inside her meticulously clean apartment, a sanctuary of order against the chaos of her work as a pediatric surgeon, Eleanor was finally at peace. The long hours, the life and death decisions, all faded away into the soft glow of a single lamp. And then, her phone chimed, a sharp, intrusive sound that sliced through the silence. It was a message from an old friend, containing only a link and 6 chilling words. "Eleanor, you have to see this." Curiosity, tinged with a faint unease, guided her finger to the screen. The link opened to a blog post, its title designed for maximum impact, and beneath it, a photo of her and her ex-husband, Julian Croft, from happier times. But the words that followed were a twisted perversion of their shared history. Julian, the aspiring writer she had supported for years, had finally written his masterpiece. It was a work of fiction, starring her as the villain. The post, and the storm of social media shares that accompanied it, painted a portrait of a reckless, unethical surgeon. It spoke of trembling hands and the smell of alcohol, of hushed-up mistakes and a cold indifference to the small lives she held in her hands. Each sentence was a carefully crafted piece of venom designed to dismantle her reputation, her career, her very identity. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. The room became cold, the air thin. The world shrank to the cold, blue light of the screen, where strangers were devouring these lies, sharing them, commenting on them, judging her. The initial shock was a paralyzing wave, a numbness that precedes immense pain. But as she scrolled, as the scale of his betrayal became devastatingly clear, the shock receded. It was replaced by something else, something far colder and more dangerous. It was a quiet, crystalline rage. This wasn't the messy fallout of a painful divorce. This was a declaration of war. And Julian, in his desperate bid for attention, had made a grave miscalculation. He had forgotten that he was not warring against a heartbroken ex-wife. He was warring against a surgeon, a woman who knew how to cut away disease with unwavering precision, and who would not hesitate to do whatever it took to save a life, especially when that life was her own. To understand the depth of the betrayal, you must first understand the beauty of the facade. The life Eleanor Vance and Julian Croft built together was a masterpiece of appearances, a carefully curated portrait of modern New York success. From the outside, theirs was a story people coveted. They lived in a pre-war brownstone in a quiet, tree-lined street in Brooklyn, the kind of home with original hardwood floors that creaked with history and large, south-facing windows that flooded the rooms with light. He was the artist, she was the scientist, a pairing as classic as it was romantic. Julian was the soulful, brooding writer, perpetually on the cusp of his great American novel. Eleanor was the brilliant, life-saving surgeon, a woman whose hands performed miracles on the smallest of bodies. They hosted dinner parties where the wine flowed as freely as the intellectual conversation. Their guests, a mix of doctors, writers, and gallery owners. Julian would hold court, captivating everyone with his wit and his passionate diatribes on literature, while Eleanor would listen with a quiet, proud smile, the steady anchor to his tempestuous genius. It was a beautiful picture, and for a long time, Eleanor believed in it with all her heart. Her belief was forged in a past starkly different from their polished present. Eleanor was not born to this world of inherited wealth and artistic leisure. She was the daughter of a steelworker and a school secretary from a small town in Pennsylvania, a place where ambition was a luxury few could afford. But Eleanor's ambition was not a luxury. It was a necessity, a fire in her soul that burned away every obstacle. She was a creature of sheer, unyielding will. She studied while her friends partied, worked nights at a diner to pay for her textbooks, and earned a full scholarship to a prestigious university and then to one of the top medical schools in the country. Her residency was a crucible that melted down and reforged who she was, stripping away everything but the core of her determination. Her hands, which Julian would later mock, were not golden by birthright. They were made steady through thousands of hours of relentless practice, through exhaustion so profound it felt like a physical illness, and through the terrifying, humbling weight of holding a child's life within them. Her career wasn't just a job, it was the fortress she had built, brick by painful brick, against the insecurity of her past. Julian, when she met him, was the antidote to the sterile, high-stakes world of the hospital. He was vibrant, spontaneous, and he saw her, truly saw her, not as Dr. Vance, the rising star of pediatric surgery, but as Eleanor, the woman who loved old movies and rainy Sundays. He was her escape, the poet to her pragmatist. In the early days of their marriage, he was her biggest champion. He would wait up for her after a grueling 36-hour shift, a hot meal ready, and listen for hours as she unburdened the stresses of her day. He celebrated her promotions, framed her awards, and told her, with what she believed was genuine admiration, that she was changing the world. She, in turn, believed in his talent with the fierce loyalty she applied to everything she cared about. When his first novel failed to find a publisher, she was the one who encouraged him not to give up. When money was tight, she insisted on covering all their expenses so he could write without the pressure of a day job. She saw it as a partnership. They were investing in each other's dreams. But a partnership requires a balance of power, and slowly, imperceptibly at first, the scales began to tip. Her star ascended with breathtaking speed, while his remained stubbornly fixed on the horizon. With each new honor she received, a subtle shadow would pass over his features. At a hospital fundraising gala, where Eleanor was given a prestigious award, she saw him standing at the back of the ballroom, nursing a drink, his applause just a fraction of a second behind everyone else's. Later that night, as she placed the heavy glass trophy on their mantelpiece, he remarked with a thin smile, "Another shiny thing. Must be nice. You save lives. And I just murder trees to write stories no one wants to read." The comment, disguised as self-deprecating humor, was a small, sharp splinter of resentment lodging itself under her skin. The splinters began to multiply. There were arguments, cloaked as discussions, about her schedule. Her on-call nights became a personal affront to him. An emergency surgery that saved a newborn's life was, in his narrative, an evening she had selfishly chosen to abandon him. And then there was Margaret, Julian's mother. On the surface, Margaret Croft was the perfect mother-in-law, a woman who embraced Eleanor as the daughter she never had. She would arrive at their home with homemade casseroles and a bottle of wine, always full of praise for Eleanor's demanding career. "I don't know how you do it, dear," she would say to her friends at family gatherings, placing a perfectly manicured hand on Eleanor's arm. "She's a miracle worker, a true saint." But her praise always came with a postscript about her son. "My Julian is so lucky to have such a strong woman by his side. An artist's soul is a fragile thing, you know. He feels everything so deeply." Over time, Eleanor began to realize that in Margaret's eyes, her strength was not her own virtue, but a resource for Julian to draw upon. Her success was not a personal achievement, but a cushion for his comfort. She wasn't Eleanor Vance, MD. She was the support system for Julian Croft, the misunderstood genius. Margaret wasn't welcoming a daughter. She was vetting a caretaker for her precious son, and as long as Eleanor fulfilled that role, she was adored. The financial arrangement, once a symbol of her support for his dream, became a source of quiet shame for him and a burden of unspoken tension for her. It was no longer a temporary measure, it was their reality. Her salary paid for the brownstone, the European vacations he insisted they needed for his inspiration, the expensive scotch he drank while lamenting his writer's block. She was the bank, and he was a permanent and increasingly resentful beneficiary. The man who had once celebrated her was now being consumed by what she provided. He began to refer to her work with a dismissive, condescending tone. "Off to play God again?" he'd ask as she left for the hospital. He called her dedication a pathological need for control, her ambition a cold, unfeeling machine. Every compliment she received from the world outside their home, he twisted into a criticism of himself. He was drowning in the shadow of her success, and instead of learning to swim, he was trying to pull her down with him. Looking back from the wreckage, Eleanor could see it all so clearly. A perfect portrait is, after all, an illusion, a trick of light and shadow designed to hide the flaws in the subject. And for years, she'd been so captivated by the beautiful image of their life together that she had refused to see the cracks spiderwebbing across the canvas, refused to acknowledge the slow, creeping rot that was consuming the man she loved from the inside out. The picture was perfect, but the frame was poisoned, and the first, undeniable crack was about to shatter the entire illusion. The final, shattering crack in the portrait of their marriage did not come from the immense, grinding pressure of their diverging lives. It came from a single, sharp impact. It wasn't her career that broke them, as Julian would later claim in his self-serving narratives. It was a betrayal as old and as common as time itself, discovered in the most modern of ways. A foundation can withstand an earthquake, but it cannot survive being hollowed out from within. Eleanor had grown accustomed to a certain level of financial ambiguity in their marriage. She was the earner, he was the artist, and the money flowed in only one direction. But it was her nature to be precise, to account for things. And one Tuesday evening, while reconciling her credit card statements for a tax audit, she found an anomaly. Not one, but a pattern. A series of charges over several months at an upscale boutique hotel in a part of town they never frequented. Expensive dinners for two at intimate restaurants. A recurring payment to a high-end florist. They were not extravagant sums, not enough to raise a major alarm, but they were consistent, a quiet, steady bleed. It was a data trail, and Eleanor, a woman who read diagnostic charts for a living, knew how to follow one. Her first assumption was not infidelity, but something almost more innocent. Perhaps he had a secret project, a surprise. But the surgeon in her, the part that always looked for the worst-case scenario in order to be prepared, could not ignore the data. So she did something she had never done before. She opened his laptop, which he'd left on his desk, intending only to check his calendar for any clues. He hadn't logged out of his social media. And there, at the top of his messages, was a conversation with a woman named Chloe. The profile picture showed a girl barely out of her 20s, all bright eyes, pouty lips, and expertly filtered light. Her bio described her as a lifestyle curator and digital storyteller. As Eleanor scrolled, a cold, heavy dread settled in her stomach. The messages were a nauseating mix of sycophantic praise and shared contempt. Chloe lauded his unpublished manuscript as a work of misunderstood genius. She called him a visionary, trapped in a gilded cage. And she referred to Eleanor, his wife, as the Ice Queen and Dr. Perfect. Julian, in turn, soaked it up like a dying plant in a downpour. He complained about Eleanor's schedule, her supposed lack of emotion, her inability to understand the delicate soul of an artist. He was performing the role of the tragic hero, and Chloe was his captive audience of one. The affair was not just physical. It was a betrayal of the mind, a conspiracy of the ego. He hadn't just found another body. He had found a mirror that reflected back a version of himself he desperately wanted to be. The confrontation, when it came, was terrifying in its stillness. There was no shouting, no throwing of plates, no tearful accusations. That was not Eleanor's way. She waited for him to come home from his writing session at a local cafe. She was sitting in the living room, the space filled with furniture she had paid for, under the light of a lamp she had chosen. The tablet displaying the messages and the credit card statements was on the coffee table between them. She didn't speak as he walked in. She simply gestured to the chair opposite her. He began to talk about his day, a nervous energy about him, but her silence cut him off. Her eyes were calm, her expression unreadable, the way it was just before she made her first incision. "Julian," she said, her voice even and devoid of emotion. "I need you to look at this." He saw the tablet and the color drained from his face. He stammered, denied, attempted to deflect. "What is this, Eleanor? Are you spying on me now? Going through my private things? After everything I've given up for you?" Eleanor didn't rise to the bait. She let his blustering fill the space, and when he paused for breath, she spoke again, her voice as sharp and clean as a scalpel. "I am not interested in your performance. I am interested in the facts. The hotel charges, the dinners, the messages, explain them." Pinned by her unwavering gaze, stripped of his charm and his wit, the real Julian emerged. It was not a pretty sight. The facade of the wounded artist crumbled, revealing an ugly, snarling core of resentment. "Explain them?" he sneered, his voice dripping with a venom she had never heard before. "You want an explanation? Fine. I was lonely. I was suffocating. I needed to be with someone who sees me as a man, not an accessory, someone who understands passion and art, not just charts and surgical schedules. You left me no choice, Eleanor. You were never here. You are married to that goddamn hospital, to the sick children you care more about than your own husband. Chloe, she understands me. She believes in me. Your ambition, your cold, perfect ambition, it drove me to her." In that moment, something inside Eleanor went quiet. It was not the sound of a heart breaking, it was the clinical silence of a heart stopping. The pain was immense, but it was overshadowed by a profound, chilling clarity. He felt no remorse. He truly, genuinely believed he was the victim. He had taken her support, her money, her loyalty, and her love, and twisted them into a cage of his own making, then blamed her for his imprisonment. The man she thought she had married, the partner she thought she was building a life with, did not exist. He was a character, a fiction of his own creation. The surgeon in her mind took over. She was no longer a wife looking at her husband. She was a doctor looking at a terminal diagnosis. The marriage was a malignancy, and there was no saving it. It had to be excised. The divorce that followed was brutally efficient. Eleanor hired the best lawyer in the city and gave her one instruction: make it fast. I will pay whatever it takes to have him out of my life. She offered Julian a settlement so generous it made her lawyer's eyebrows shoot up. It was a fortune. Enough for him to live comfortably for years and fund whatever artistic endeavors he chose. It was not an act of kindness. It was a transaction. It was the price of her freedom, and she considered it a bargain. Julian accepted, of course, but the money was not what he wanted. To him, the settlement was the ultimate insult. It was a final, irrefutable confirmation of his failure, a dismissal, a golden handshake from the successful wife he secretly despised. As he signed the papers, the look in his eyes was not one of gratitude, but of pure, unadulterated hatred. Eleanor felt a wave of relief as the ink dried, the relief of a successful, albeit painful, amputation. She believed the disease had been removed. She believed it was over, but she was wrong. This was not the final chapter. It was merely the end of the prologue. For Julian Croft, the generous settlement was not a clean slate. It was seed money for a war, and he was already planning his first, devastating attack. In the quiet aftermath of the divorce, Eleanor had allowed herself a brief, fragile period of peace. She believed that by cutting Julian out of her life, she had contained the threat. She was a surgeon, after all, trained to believe that a clean incision could solve the problem. She had failed to account for the nature of the modern world, where the most virulent infections are not bacterial, but digital. The attack did not begin with a frontal assault. It began as a whisper, a single anonymous blog post on a hastily created website called The Parkside Hospital Insider. The post was a masterpiece of insidious fiction, written with just enough truth to make the lies plausible. Julian had spent years as a fly on the wall of her world, absorbing the jargon, the rhythms, and the anxieties of hospital life. Now, he weaponized that knowledge with a writer's cruel precision. The post was titled, An Angel's Trembling Hand, and it was written from the fabricated perspective of a concerned father whose child had undergone a complex procedure. It never mentioned Eleanor by name, referring only to a star female surgeon whose public reputation masked a terrifying recklessness. It described a fictional surgery weaving a tale of a near-fatal error, a moment of panic in the operating room that was expertly covered up by the hospital's PR machine. The author wrote of the surgeon's dismissive bedside manner, her arrogance, and most damningly, of what he called a faint, sweet smell on her breath, like expensive gin. It was a single, poisonous sentence designed to burrow into the deepest fears of any parent. The post ended with a chilling, open-ended question. When our saviors become a danger, who is left to save our children? A single spark had been struck in the dry tinder of public opinion. And then, Chloe, the digital native, the curator of lifestyles, began to fan the flames. Chloe understood that a single voice is easily dismissed, but a chorus is impossible to ignore. She began to build that chorus, brick by fake, hollow brick. She shared the blog post in every conceivable online space where a concerned parent might lurk. Facebook groups for mothers in the tri-state area. Online forums for children with rare medical conditions. Community message boards. She created a dozen fake profiles, each with a carefully constructed backstory. There was concerned nurse 85, a supposed Parkside RN, who would comment with phrases like, "This is so brave of you to speak out. We've been seeing this for months." Everyone is too scared of her to say anything. There was sorrowful dad, who would reply with a heart-wrenching and completely fabricated story of how his own son was left with permanent damage after a procedure by the same doctor. Chloe crafted these personas with the same attention to detail she applied to her own filtered life, giving them children, hobbies, and a veneer of authenticity that was terrifyingly effective. The campaign was a slow, relentless drip of poison. A few days after the initial post, a new one would appear, this time detailing another supposed incident. Chloe would then seed online review sites with anonymous one-star ratings for Dr. Vance, citing her arrogance and unprofessionalism. She even managed to doctor a photograph from a past hospital gala, cropping it to show only Eleanor holding a glass of champagne, and posted it with the caption, "Celebrating another successful week," or "Just getting started." At first, Eleanor tried to ignore it. It was the garbage of the internet, the rantings of a bitter man. Her work, her results, her reputation built over 15 years of flawless service would speak for itself. But a lie, when repeated often enough, begins to take on the texture of truth. The digital whispers began to leak into the real world. She first noticed it in the hallways of the hospital. Conversations would fall silent as she approached. The friendly morning greetings from the nursing staff were replaced with tight, anxious smiles and averted eyes. Her colleagues, the men and women she had stood shoulder to shoulder with in life or death situations, began to treat her with a cautious, clinical distance. They would ask her if she was doing okay with a look of pity that was more insulting than any accusation. Then came the phone calls to her office. Her secretary, a loyal woman who had been with her for a decade, would relay the messages with a pained expression. "Mrs. Albright is postponing Tyler's surgery. She wants a second opinion. The Patels are transferring their daughter's care to Mount Sinai. They said it was for personal reasons." Each cancellation was a physical blow, a vote of no confidence that chipped away at the very core of who she was. The tipping point came when she was summoned to the office of Dr. Marcus Thorne, the hospital's chief of surgery, and the man who had once been her mentor. He didn't ask her to sit down immediately. He stood by his window, looking out over the city, his hands clasped behind his back. The formality was a chilling omen. "Eleanor," he began, his voice heavy with institutional gravity, "the board has been made aware of certain allegations circulating online." He used the careful, sterile language of damage control. He spoke of the hospital's reputation, of patient confidence, of the paramount importance of transparency. He never once asked her if the stories were true. He was not there as a friend or a mentor. He was there as a corporate officer protecting his brand. "Therefore," he concluded, finally turning to face her, his expression a mask of professional regret, "the board has decided it is in the best interest of all parties to place you on temporary administrative leave, pending a full internal investigation." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Administrative leave. It was a euphemism, a polite way of casting her out. She had to surrender her pager, her hospital ID card, and transfer her active cases to other surgeons. The process was a ritual of quiet humiliation. packing the personal effects from her office, a photo of her parents, a child's crayon drawing of a smiling son, her favorite medical textbook into a small cardboard box, felt like packing up a life that had suddenly ended. As she walked out of the hospital she had considered her second home, the place where she had poured her heart and soul, she felt the stares of her colleagues. They were not stares of anger, but of fear and pity. She was a cautionary tale. The fortress she had spent a lifetime building, the one she thought was impregnable, was burning to the ground. And the arsonists were miles away, sitting comfortably behind a screen, watching the flames rise higher and higher, their faces lit by the triumphant glow of their success. For the first week of her suspension, Eleanor existed in a state of suspended animation. Her life, once a whirlwind of controlled chaos of beeping monitors, urgent consultations, and 12-hour surgeries, was now an abyss of profound and unnerving silence. The silence was the real enemy. It gave the anonymous, venomous voices from the internet endless space to echo in her mind. A lesser person might have shattered under the weight of it, might have succumbed to the despair that clawed at the edges of her consciousness. But Eleanor Vance was not a lesser person. She was a surgeon. And a surgeon is, at their core, a fixer, a pragmatist who confronts trauma not with emotion, but with a plan. In the sterile quiet of her apartment, she allowed herself exactly 48 hours to grieve for the life that had been stolen from her. She let the waves of anger, humiliation, and betrayal wash over her until she was numb. And then, on the third day, she stood up, washed her face, and began to prepare for surgery. The patient was her life, and the disease was Julian Croft. Her first move was to find the right instrument. She didn't seek out a loud, theatrical trial lawyer. She researched with the same intensity she would use to find a new surgical technique, looking for a specialist, a master of a very specific, very difficult craft. Her search led her to a name whispered with a kind of grudging reverence in New York legal circles: Benjamin Carter. Carter was a lawyer who specialized in the murky, brutal world of defamation, libel, and slander. His office was not the gleaming glass tower of a corporate firm, but a discreet, book-lined suite in an older building, a place that smelled of old paper and quiet confidence. Carter himself was in his late 50s, a man whose calm demeanor concealed a mind like a steel trap. He listened to Eleanor's story without interruption, his face impassive, his fingers steepled under his chin. When she finished, he didn't offer platitudes or promises. He offered a cold dose of reality. "Dr. Vance," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone, "I need you to understand what you're facing. Defamation is one of the most difficult things to prove in American law. You don't just have to prove that what your ex-husband is saying is false. You have to prove that he knew it was false when he said it, or that he acted with reckless disregard for the truth. We call it actual malice. It is a mountain to climb. They will dig into every corner of your life, looking for any shred of evidence to support their lies. It will be expensive, it will be exhausting, and it will be emotionally savage. Are you prepared for that?" He was testing her, looking for a crack in her resolve. He found none. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "Mr. Carter," she replied, her voice as steady as his, "I have stood for 14 hours straight, with my hands inside the chest of a 2-day-old infant, fighting to save a life the size of my fist. I do not scare easily. This is not about my feelings. This is a targeted attack on my ability to do my job. These lies are not just destroying me, they are a threat to my patients, current and future, who may be scared away from receiving necessary care. This is no longer a personal matter. He has made it a matter of public safety. I am prepared to do whatever it takes." A flicker of something respect, perhaps, crossed Carter's face. He nodded slowly. "All right, doctor. Let's get to work." Her apartment, once a sanctuary from the hospital, became a war room. The polished mahogany dining table was covered in laptops, legal pads, and stacks of paper. It was her new operating theater, and the enemy was a ghost in the machine. This was not a war that would be won with righteous anger, but with data. Eleanor, channeling the entirety of her grief and rage into a singular, focused purpose, became a digital detective. With the meticulous precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex procedure, she began to assemble the evidence. She worked backwards, from the most recent post to the very first spark. She took a screenshot of every article, every comment, every shared post. She printed them out, hundreds of pages of digital venom, and spread them across her floor. She began to catalog the fake profiles Chloe had created, giving each one a file. She built a timeline, noting the dates and exact times of each post. She cross-referenced their activity, finding patterns. Concerned Nurse 85 and Sorrowful Dad were strangely never online at the same time. They often used similar turns of phrase, made the same grammatical errors. She was dissecting the lies, exposing the shoddy stitching that held the narrative together. While Eleanor worked on the front lines of the data, Carter brought in his specialist, a digital forensics expert named Kenji Tanaka. Kenji was a young man who looked like he'd be more at home at a video game convention than in a lawyer's office, but he spoke about the internet as if it were a living organism whose anatomy he knew intimately. He explained to Eleanor how they would attempt to pierce the corporate veil, to trace the anonymous blog's registration through the labyrinth of shell corporations and offshore servers designed to protect its owner's identity. "It's a ghost hunt," Kenji admitted, looking at the mountain of data Eleanor had already collected. "They're using VPNs to mask their location, encrypted emails. They've been smart, but everyone makes mistakes. Our job is to find that one tiny mistake." The days that followed were a grueling, frustrating grind. For every lead they pursued, they hit a digital wall. The server was in Iceland. The domain was paid for with cryptocurrency. The fake profiles were linked to untraceable burner email accounts. It was an asymmetrical war. It took Julian and Chloe mere seconds to vomit a lie into the world, and it was taking Eleanor and her team weeks of painstaking, expensive work to trace its origins. But Eleanor did not waver. The work, as arduous as it was a balm to her soul. It was action. It was control. It was the antithesis of the powerlessness she had felt when her world was collapsing. Then, late one night, after days of sifting through server logs, Kenji found it. The mistake. It was small, almost insignificant. A single comment, left by the concerned nurse 85 profile, on a local news site's Facebook page. For a fleeting moment, a window of maybe 30 seconds, the user's VPN must have dropped its connection. The comment was posted from an unmasked IP address. It wasn't a direct link to a home computer, which would have been too easy. The IP address was registered to a small independent coffee shop in Soho. It wasn't the smoking gun. It wasn't enough to take to a judge. But Benjamin Carter, upon hearing the news, allowed himself a small, thin smile. He pulled up a map on his computer, located the coffee shop, and then searched for nearby residences. 2.5 blocks away, in a chic, overpriced loft, was the registered address of one Chloe Weber. The ghost suddenly had a shadow. The hunters had their first scent on the trail. In the quiet of her war room, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in months, a flicker of hope. The wildfire was still burning, but they had found the arsonist's footprint in the ash. The discovery of Chloe's IP address was a tactical victory, a small, hard piece of data in a war of phantoms and shadows. It was a lead for Benjamin Carter and his team to pursue, a thread to pull in the vast, tangled web of lies. But for Eleanor, it was not enough. Logic and evidence were her profession, but the wound she had suffered was profoundly personal, and there was a small, stubborn, all too human part of her that still clung to a desperate hope for a non-legal resolution. It was a hope centered on one person, Margaret Croft. Her lawyer, Benjamin Carter, had advised strongly against it. "Don't engage," he had warned, his voice firm. "She is his mother. Blood is thicker than water, and you are no longer blood." But this was one piece of advice Eleanor couldn't take. This wasn't a strategic move. It was a final, personal appeal. Before a surgeon resorts to the radical excision, they explore every less invasive option. This visit was Eleanor's last attempt to stop the bleeding without resorting to the cold, impersonal blade of the law. She drove to Margaret's home in the suburbs, a place she had once associated with holiday dinners, summer barbecues, and a sense of belonging. The house was, as always, perfect. The lawn was immaculately manicured, the windows gleamed, and the welcome mat looked brand new. It was a fortress of domestic tranquility, a stark contrast to the chaos that had engulfed Eleanor's life. Margaret opened the door with a look of practiced surprise, her face a carefully arranged mask of concern. "Eleanor, my dear, what a surprise. Come in, come in." She ushered Eleanor into the living room, a space so clean and orderly it felt like a museum exhibit. Every surface was polished, every cushion plumped, and everywhere, on every wall and every tabletop, were framed photographs of Julian. Julian as a smiling, gap-toothed boy. Julian in his high school football uniform. Julian on his graduation day. It was a shrine to her son, and Eleanor, for the first time, felt like an intruder in it. Margaret insisted on making tea, a ritual of normalcy that felt grotesque under the circumstances. They sat in antique chairs, the delicate china cups rattling softly in their saucers as an oppressive silence filled the room. Finally, Eleanor put her cup down and broke the facade. "Margaret, I'm not here for a social visit." She pulled out her tablet, the same one she had used to confront Julian, and placed it on the coffee table. "I'm here because I need your help. I need you to see what your son is doing." With a steady hand, she showed Margaret everything. The blog posts, the vicious, anonymous comments, the doctored photos. She explained the consequences, her suspension from the hospital, the investigation, the career she had spent a lifetime building now hanging in the balance. Her voice was calm, factual, pleading. "I know he is hurting from the divorce," Eleanor said, her voice softening. "And I know this girl, Chloe, is a terrible influence. But this goes beyond anger. He is destroying my life with lies. You are his mother. He will listen to you. Please, just talk to him. Ask him to stop this before he destroys himself along with me." As she spoke, Margaret's face crumpled. Tears welled in her eyes, and she dabbed at them with a silk handkerchief. She put a hand to her chest, the very picture of a heartbroken mother. "Oh, my dear girl," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "This is monstrous, absolutely monstrous. To think that my Julian could be involved. No, it must be that awful girl. She is a viper, a manipulator. She has twisted his pain and used it for her own selfish games. My boy, my sensitive boy. He wouldn't do this on his own." A tiny, fragile bud of hope began to bloom in Eleanor's chest. She felt a wave of relief. Margaret saw the truth. She understood. But as Eleanor continued to detail the evidence of Julian's direct involvement, the specific phrases he used, the intimate knowledge of her life that no one else could possess, the look on Margaret's face began to change. The tears of sympathy for Eleanor slowly dried up, and her expression hardened into one of fierce, maternal defensiveness. The pivot, when it came, was swift and brutal. "But Eleanor," Margaret said, her tone shifting from sympathetic to gently chiding, "you have to admit, you were never really here for him. You were always at that hospital. A man with Julian's creative spirit, his sensitivity, he needs affirmation. He needs to feel he is the center of his wife's world. Is it really so surprising that he felt abandoned?" Eleanor stared at her, stunned into silence. The conversation was twisting, warping into something unrecognizable. "Margaret, he is accusing me of drinking before surgery. He is fabricating stories that could send me to prison and ruin me forever. This has nothing to do with me working late." And then, the mask of the loving mother-in-law fell away completely, revealing the cold, hard face of an enabler beneath. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes no longer soft, but filled with a cold, clear pity that was more insulting than any anger. "There is no smoke without fire, dear," she said, her voice now dripping with a condescending sweetness. "Julian is passionate. He feels things deeply. When he is hurt, he lashes out. He has always been that way. Perhaps if you had been a gentler wife to him, a more understanding partner, he wouldn't have felt the need to be so dramatic. You have to understand, you drove him to this. Your ambition, your coldness. It wounded him. A woman's bitterness can drive a good man to do terrible things." The words struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. It was the exact same script Julian had used, the same twisted logic that painted him as the victim and her as the aggressor. She realized in that horrifying moment of clarity that Margaret was not just defending her son, she was the original author of his narrative. She was the one who had spent a lifetime convincing him that he was a fragile genius, that his flaws were artistic quirks, and that his failures were always someone else's fault. Eleanor had never been a daughter to this woman. She had been a function, a high-performing accessory for her perfect son. And the moment she ceased to serve that function, she was not just disposable, she was the enemy. Without another word, Eleanor stood up. The teacup remained untouched. The tablet lay dark on the table. There was nothing left to say. The hope she had carried into this house now lay in ashes at her feet. She walked out of the shrine to Julian, leaving Margaret sitting amidst her polished furniture and her perfectly framed lies. As she drove away, she did not cry. The pain was too deep, too fundamental for tears. Julian's betrayal had been an act of war, born of a jealousy she could almost understand. It was an external wound, but this was a betrayal of the soul. It poisoned the past, corrupting every memory of family dinners and shared laughter, revealing them as a hollow performance. It taught her a final, brutal lesson. The war she had to fight was not just against Julian. It was against an entire world of delusion that he and his mother had built around themselves. And there was no longer any room for mercy. The visit to Margaret Croft's home was the closing of an emotional door, a final, painful acceptance that this war would not be won with appeals to decency or family. It would be won with facts, in a sterile room, under the cold, impartial gaze of the law. The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday in late autumn. It was the first time Eleanor would be in the same room as Julian and Chloe since the day she had presented him with the evidence of his affair. This, however, was not a confrontation in a sunlit living room. This was a formal, recorded proceeding in a claustrophobic, beige conference room in a downtown office building. The air was thick with the scent of old coffee and a palpable, simmering animosity. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly, sterile pallor on everyone's faces. It was a modern dueling ground, where the weapons were not pistols, but carefully chosen words, and the objective was not to kill, but to dismantle. Eleanor arrived with Benjamin Carter 5 minutes early. She was dressed in a simple navy blue sheath dress and a matching blazer. She looked less like a litigant and more like a doctor about to present at a grand rounds meeting, professional, composed, and unreadable. She took her seat and placed her hands calmly on the polished table, her posture perfect. She was in a high-pressure environment where precision mattered. She was in her element. Julian and Chloe arrived moments later, a stark and jarring contrast. Julian wore a tweed jacket, a pathetic attempt at a scholarly, serious author look, but his eyes darted around the room, betraying a deep-seated nervousness. Chloe was dressed for a fashion shoot, not a legal proceeding, in a bright pink pantsuit that seemed to scream for attention in the muted room. She was smirking, trying to project an aura of bored, untouchable confidence, but the constant, rapid tapping of her manicured nails on the table betrayed her anxiety. They were performing, and their audience of lawyers and a single court reporter was not impressed. The first 2 hours were a grueling exercise in character assassination, with Julian and Chloe's lawyer grilling Eleanor. He was an aggressive, theatrical man who paced the room, his questions dripping with insinuation. He brought up every lie from the blog, framing them as established facts. Dr. Vance, is it true that on the night of May 14th, you consumed 3 glasses of wine at a hospital fundraiser, just hours before you were scheduled to be on call? Can you explain to us why 3 of your former nurses filed complaints about your abrasive and dismissive attitude? Isn't it a fact that a culture of fear in your operating room prevented junior staff from speaking up when they saw you make a mistake? Through it all, Eleanor remained a placid lake of calm. She answered each question with the same dispassionate, factual precision she would use to describe a medical chart. I had 1 glass of wine at the fundraiser, and I was not on call until the following evening. The nurses' complaints were part of a union dispute regarding overtime hours and were ultimately dismissed. My operating room is a place of discipline and focus, not fear. Every member of my team is encouraged and required to speak up if they have a concern. She gave him nothing. Her testimony was a flat line of irrefutable truth, and his attempts to provoke her, to find an emotional crack, failed spectacularly. Then, the dynamic in the room shifted entirely. Benjamin Carter began his examination. He did not pace. He did not raise his voice. He sat perfectly still, his questions delivered in a calm, almost conversational tone that was far more unnerving than any theatrical outburst. He began with Chloe. He didn't ask about the lies. He started by asking about her. "Miss Weber, you describe yourself as a digital brand strategist. Is that correct?" Chloe, preening, confirmed that it was. For the next 20 minutes, Carter had her explain, in minute detail, the mechanics of her profession. She boasted about her ability to create viral content, to manage narratives, to build an online following from scratch, using targeted hashtags and emotional triggers. She was so blinded by her own ego, so eager to portray herself as a digital marketing genius, that she didn't realize she was building her own cage. Carter was establishing her, in her own words, as a professional, expert manipulator of public opinion. His approach with Julian was different. It was not about skill, it was about motive. Carter's questions were quiet, simple, and utterly devastating. "Mr. Croft, in the 12 years of your marriage to Dr. Vance, what was your total declared income from your writing?" Julian flushed a deep, ugly red. Art doesn't have a price tag. Carter didn't react. The court, however, deals in numbers. "Please answer the question." The answer, when it came, was a mumbled, humiliatingly small figure. Carter continued, his voice gentle. "So it would be fair to say that Dr. Vance was the primary, if not sole, financial support for your household." He then picked up a printout of the first blog post. The post describes a complicated cardiac procedure on a neonatal patient. It uses highly specific medical terminology: truncus arteriosus repair, pulmonary artery banding. "Where did you acquire such specialized knowledge, Mr. Croft?" Julian stammered. I do my research." Carter nodded slowly. "Or is it perhaps because Dr. Vance, in a moment of marital intimacy, shared with you the details of one of her most challenging and ultimately successful surgeries, a story she told you with pride, which you later twisted into a story of failure and malpractice?" The air in the room grew thin, but Carter was just getting started. He turned his attention back to Chloe. "Miss Weber, are you familiar with an online profile by the name of Concerned Nurse 85? Chloe, her smirk now gone, shook her head. "I've seen the name in the comments, but I have no idea who that island." Carter then looked at Julian. "And you, Mr. Croft?" Julian, attempting to be clever, said, "I've read the comments. They seem to come from a very credible, very brave person." "I see," Carter said softly. He then slid a document across the table. It was a forensic recovery report from the laptop Julian had used during the marriage. It showed the saved, deleted draft of a blog post. In the draft, Julian had misspelled a rare congenital heart defect. Carter then slid a second document across the table. It was a screenshot of a comment from Concerned Nurse 85, posted 2 weeks after the blog went live. The comment used the exact same, uniquely misspelled name for the heart defect. Carter let the silence hang in the air for a full 10 seconds. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "it appears you and this anonymous, brave nurse not only share a passion for patient advocacy, you also share the same, rather specific, spelling error. Can you please explain this remarkable coincidence to the court?" The room was utterly still. Julian's face was a mask of pure white panic. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Chloe shot him a look of venomous fury. In that single moment, their entire united front, their carefully constructed narrative of shared righteous indignation, shattered. Julian's lawyer, flustered, immediately called for a recess. As they scrambled out of the room, Eleanor saw Chloe grab Julian's arm, her perfectly painted lips moving in a furious, silent tirade. The arrogance had evaporated, replaced by the raw, primal terror of being caught. The first battle was over. The lies were still out there, The wildfire was still burning, but a precise surgical strike had just severed a major artery in the heart of their deception. And for the first time in a long time, Eleanor Vance could see a path through the smoke. The deposition was a strategic victory, a precise strike that had left visible cracks in the enemy's facade. For the first time, Julian and Chloe's arrogant confidence had been replaced by the sour, acrid stench of fear. But Benjamin Carter, in the quiet debriefing in his office, was cautiously pragmatic. A crack, he explained to Eleanor, is not a collapse. We wounded them, he said, his voice calm and measured as he looked over the transcript. We exposed a lie, a significant one, but their lawyer will spin it. He'll call it a coincidence, a shared mistake, a simple error. In court, a jury needs more than a strong probability. They need certainty. We have proved they are liars, doctor. Now we have to prove they are malicious. We need the smoking gun. And so, the hunt intensified, moving from the open field of the deposition into the dense, dark forests of the digital and human worlds. The work was divided into two fronts. The first was led by Kenji Tanaka, the digital forensics expert, who now, armed with court-ordered subpoenas, could dive deeper than ever before. He was no longer just a tracker. He was an auditor, following the faint, ghostly trail of money. He spent days sifting through a labyrinth of shell accounts, payment processors, and cryptocurrency wallets, a world designed to be untraceable. He was looking for a single, tangible link between Chloe's carefully hidden finances and the sprawling, anonymous architecture of the smear campaign. For weeks, the search yielded nothing but frustrating dead ends. And then, one rainy afternoon, Kenji found it. It was a single transaction for $5,000 sent from a holding company registered in Delaware, which Kenji managed to link back to a personal savings account held by Chloe Weber. The recipient was a company with a bland, corporate-sounding name, Amplified Digital Solutions. On the surface, it could have been for anything, but Kenji was a creature of the internet's underbelly. He knew the names. He ran a deep search on the company and found what he was looking for on a series of obscure message boards for black hat marketers. Amplified Digital Solutions was a well-known, high-end bot farm. For a price, they would unleash an army of fake accounts to like, share, and comment on any post, creating the instant illusion of a massive, organic, viral outrage. Carter, when he saw the evidence, allowed himself a rare, thin smile. They didn't just light a match, he said to Eleanor. They paid to pour gasoline on the fire. This proves premeditation of the highest order. They manufactured the mob. It was a crucial piece of the puzzle, a powerful weapon, but it still wasn't the smoking gun. It proved they had orchestrated the campaign's spread, but it didn't irrefutably prove they were the original authors of the lies themselves. For that, they needed something more. They needed a human source. While Kenji hunted ghosts in the machine, Carter had employed a more traditional asset, a private investigator named Maria Flores. Maria was a quiet, unassuming woman in her 40s, the kind of person who could blend into any background, who radiated a calm empathy that made people want to talk. Her task was to reconstruct Chloe Weber's life, to map her social and professional circles, and to find the fault lines, the broken friendships, the soured business deals, the discarded allies. Carter's theory was simple. A narcissist like Chloe would have needed to brag, and a user like Chloe would have left a trail of resentful, burned-out people in her wake. Maria's investigation quickly led her to a name, Isabella Rossi. Isabella was a struggling fashion designer who, up until a year ago, had been Chloe's best friend and the co-founder of a boutique clothing line with her. Their falling out had been spectacular and ugly, involving accusations of stolen designs and financial deceit, ending with Chloe pushing Isabella out of the company they had built together. Isabella was now trying to launch her own label, but she was deeply in debt and professionally wounded. She was, in Carter's words, a person with a motive. The first meeting with Isabella was delicate. She was wary, bitter, and terrified of Chloe's vindictiveness. "You don't understand what she's like," Isabella told Carter, her voice trembling slightly. "She's a black hole. She pulls everyone in, uses them up, and then throws away the husk. If she finds out I talked to you, She'll destroy what's left of my career. Carter didn't pressure her. He simply laid out the facts of Eleanor's case, showing her the blog posts, the hateful comments, the devastating effect it was having on a respected surgeon's life. She did to you professionally what she is now trying to do to Dr. Vance, Carter said softly. The pattern is the same. The only difference is the scale and the stakes. We can offer you legal protection. All we are asking for is the truth. Isabella was silent for a long time, her eyes fixed on the printouts of the lies. She saw in Eleanor's predicament an echo of her own humiliation. Finally, she gave a slow, deliberate nod. I might have something, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I kept my old phone. For the business records. She used to text me about everything. What Isabella revealed in Carter's office the next day was not just a smoking gun. It was a cannon, a weapon of such devastating power it would annihilate any possible defense. It was a series of text messages from Chloe, sent in the heady, arrogant days after Julian's divorce, when their plan was just taking flight. The texts, displayed on the screen of Isabella's old phone, glowed with a malevolent glee. Carter's paralegal transcribed them as Isabella read them aloud, each word a nail in the coffin of their deception. One message read, Izzy, you are not going to believe the plan Julian and I have cooked up. The Ice Queen is about to get the public takedown she deserves. It's going to be my masterpiece of brand destruction. Another, sent a week later, accompanied by a link to the first blog post. See? It's already starting to go viral. We're going to absolutely ruin her. People will think she's a monster who hurts children. The irony is delicious. And then came the final, fatal text. The one that laid bare the entire, rotten core of their motive. Best part is, all the drama is going to make people fascinated by Julian's tragic story. His agent thinks we can spin this into a book deal. Public tragedy is the best marketing tool ever. LOL. There it was. Not just malice, not just premeditation, but a clear, psychopathic, financial motive. They weren't just destroying Eleanor's life out of spite, they were doing it as a calculated career move. They were trying to build a kingdom for themselves upon the ashes of her reputation. The hunt was over. In the quiet of his office, Benjamin Carter looked at Eleanor, and for the first time, he spoke with absolute certainty. We've got them, he said. The war is over. All that's left is the sentencing. The transition from the sterile conference room of the deposition to the hallowed halls of a courtroom was a shift in both atmosphere and gravity. The courtroom was a theater of consequences, a place of dark wood, soaring ceilings, and a heavy, solemn silence that demanded respect. The case, once a private agony, had attracted a modest amount of public attention, and a few journalists were scattered amongst the public in the gallery, notebooks ready, eager for the climax of this very modern drama of love, lies, and the internet. For Eleanor, sitting beside Benjamin Carter, the feeling was not one of fear, but of a strange, steely calm. The time for anger and grief was over. This was the final, necessary procedure. This was about restoring truth, not just for her, but for the sanctity of fact in a world drowning in fiction. This was about proving that words have meaning, and that lies have a price. Eleanor was the first major witness Carter called to the stand. As she walked to the witness box, she moved with a quiet dignity that instantly commanded the room's attention. She was not a victim seeking pity. She was an expert, there to testify on the catastrophic failure of a relationship and the subsequent malicious infection of her life. Carter led her through her story with a series of simple, direct questions. She described her career, her dedication to her patients, and the pride she took in her work. She recounted her marriage to Julian, speaking of their history with a sad, clinical detachment, devoid of bitterness. And then she described the moment she discovered the blog, the horror of seeing her life's work being systematically dismantled by fabrications. The opposing counsel's cross-examination was aggressive and ultimately ineffective. He tried to portray her as cold, arrogant, and emotionally distant, the very Ice Queen caricature from Chloe's texts. But his attacks, which had seemed menacing in the confines of a deposition, wilted under the formal scrutiny of the judge and jury. Eleanor's calm, factual responses, her refusal to be baited, her unwavering professionalism, it all worked against the narrative of a reckless, emotional monster. The jury saw what her patients and colleagues had always seen, a woman of immense competence and control. With Eleanor's testimony setting the stage, Carter began to construct his case, piece by irrefutable piece. He was not a showman, he was a builder, laying a foundation of fact so solid that no amount of legal maneuvering could shake it. He called Kenji Tanaka to the stand, who, with the aid of charts and graphs, explained the digital architecture of the smear campaign in terms a layperson could understand. He showed the jury how the anonymous blog was created, how the fake profiles were deployed, and, most critically, he presented the financial records showing Chloe Weber's payment to the bot farm. He proved, with cold, hard data, that the initial wave of public outrage that had crippled Eleanor's career was a paid-for illusion. Next came the human element. Carter called Isabella Rossi to the stand. Isabella was visibly nervous, her hands trembling as she was sworn in. But as Carter gently guided her through her story, her friendship with Chloe, the dream of their shared business, the brutal betrayal, her voice grew stronger, imbued with the conviction of a person who had been wronged. She painted a portrait of Chloe as a charming, ruthless user, a woman who saw people as pawns in the game of her own advancement. Then came the moment the entire trial had been building towards. Carter asked that the courtroom monitors be turned on. And there, projected in large, black and white text for the judge, the jury, and the entire room to see, were Chloe Weber's own words. The text messages appeared on the screen, one after another. "Going to get the public takedown she deserves. It's going to be my masterpiece of brand destruction. We're going to absolutely ruin her." And the final, sickening confession. "All the drama is going to make people fascinated by Julian's tragic story, can spin this into a book deal. Public tragedy is the best marketing tool ever. LOL." A collective, audible gasp went through the gallery. The jury members leaned forward in their seats, their eyes wide. Eleanor watched Julian's face lose all its color, while Chloe stared at the screen as if it were a ghost. The words, once casually typed in a moment of arrogant glee, had become an indelible, public monument to her malice. The cross-examinations that followed were a brutal, slow-motion demolition. When Chloe took the stand, her composure was already gone. She was defensive and hostile. Carter was relentlessly, cruelly calm. He would read one of her texts aloud and then simply ask, "Miss Weber, did you write that?" She tried to claim she was joking, that it was just gossip between friends, that her words were being twisted. But the sheer venom in the messages was impossible to explain away. Her credibility evaporated under the heat of her own words. Then, it was Julian's turn. He walked to the stand with a defiant swagger, a man determined to play the role of the misunderstood artist to the very end. Carter began not with the lies, but with the truth. He asked Julian about his wife's career, forcing him to admit, under oath, that he knew her to be a skilled and dedicated surgeon. He made him recount the long hours she worked, the lives she had saved, the sacrifices she had made. He was forcing Julian to dismantle his own lies. And then, Carter went in for the kill. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "you wrote these things. You knew they were false. You knew your wife was not a drunk, not a monster. You knew she was a healer. So I have one final question for you. Why did you do it?" And in that moment, the carefully constructed facade of the tragic victim finally, violently, exploded. Julian's face contorted in a snarl of pure, unrestrained rage. He shot to his feet, pointing a trembling finger at Eleanor. "Why?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the stunned courtroom. "Because of her. Because of Saint Eleanor and her perfect life. It was always the hospital, always the patients, always her next award. I was a ghost in my own home, in my own life. She was the brilliant sun, and I was just a shadow she dragged behind her. I wanted her to feel it, just once. I wanted her to know what it felt like to have everything you've built turn to ash. She deserved it. She deserved all of it. It was a confession, raw and absolute. It was an admission of jealousy, of resentment, of pure, unadulterated malice." His own lawyer slumped in his chair, head in his hands. Chloe looked at him with the dead eyes of someone whose lifeboat had just been set on fire by their only companion. Benjamin Carter stood motionless, allowing the toxic silence to hang in the air. When the judge asked if he had any further questions, he simply shook his head and said, in a quiet, final voice, "No, Your Honor. The witness has answered everything." Julian Croft's furious, spittle-flecked confession hung in the courtroom like a toxic cloud, a self-immolation so total and absolute that it rendered all further argument obsolete. His own words were the closing statement, a more damning indictment than anything Benjamin Carter could have possibly crafted. The defense lawyer's closing was a pathetic, half-hearted attempt at damage control, trying to frame the outburst as a cry for help from a man broken by a failed marriage. But it was impossible to unring that bell. The jury had not just heard the evidence, they had seen the malice, raw and unveiled. They had looked directly into the resentful, jealous heart of the crime. The wait for the verdict was its own unique form of torture. For 2 days, Eleanor existed in a legal purgatory, her life on hold while 12 strangers deliberated her truth. The frenetic, high-stakes drama of the trial was replaced by a slow, agonizing silence. She sat with Carter in a small, sterile waiting room, the minutes stretching into an eternity. For a woman whose entire life was defined by her own decisive actions, this powerlessness was the final, cruel test of her endurance. Her fate, her name, her past, and her future were all being debated in a locked room, and all she could do was wait. The summons back to the courtroom came on the 3rd day. The air inside was thick and heavy, charged with an almost unbearable tension. Eleanor walked to her seat with the same measured calm she had maintained throughout the trial, but she could feel her heart hammering against her ribs. The jury filed in, their faces grim and unreadable, each one pointedly avoiding eye contact with either the plaintiff or the defendants. Julian and Chloe sat huddled at their table, pale and diminished, their previous arrogance replaced by a shared, sickly dread. The court clerk asked the jury foreman to stand. The rustle of a single sheet of paper was the loudest sound in the world. On the first count of defamation against the plaintiff, Dr. Eleanor Vance, the foreman began, his voice flat and formal. "How do you find?" He paused, taking a breath. "We, the jury, find the defendants, Julian Croft and Chloe Weber, liable." A single, collective exhale swept through the courtroom. Eleanor felt a tremor pass through her body, a release of tension so profound it was almost painful. It was the first confirmation. The truth had been officially recognized. The foreman continued, his voice droning on as he read through the specific findings of liability for libel, slander, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. With each guilty verdict, Chloe seemed to shrink further into her chair, while Julian stared blankly at the far wall, his face a gray, empty mask. Then came the matter of damages. The foreman cleared his throat and read the figures. The compensatory damages for her lost income and legal fees were substantial. But it was the punitive damages, the number meant to punish and deter, that sucked the remaining air from the room. It was a figure in the millions, a sum so large it was clearly intended not just as a penalty, but as an obliteration. It was financial ruin, absolute and undeniable. Chloe let out a small, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Julian simply closed his eyes, as if the darkness behind his eyelids was preferable to the catastrophic reality in front of him. But the most significant part of the verdict was yet to come. The judge, his face stern and his voice resonating with the full authority of the court, addressed the defendants directly. He spoke of the grievous and malicious nature of their campaign, calling it a cowardly, technological assault on a distinguished career and a human being's good name. He then delivered the final, most crucial part of his judgment, the part Carter had fought for, the part that mattered more to Eleanor than any amount of money. Beyond the financial judgment, the judge declared, "This court issues a permanent injunction. The defendants are hereby ordered to remove, and caused to be removed, every blog post, social media entry, comment, and image related to this defamatory campaign from the internet, in perpetuity, within the next 48 hours. He wasn't finished. Furthermore, The defendants are ordered to post a full, court-approved retraction and apology on the blog The Parkside Hospital Insider and on every social media platform that was used in the initial attack. This public apology is to remain posted, without alteration, for a period of no less than 1 year. The gavel fell, the sound cracking through the silent courtroom like a gunshot. It was over. The victory was total. In the aftermath, the defendants' table seemed to implode. Chloe, the confident brand strategist, the curator of a perfect life, finally broke completely. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with ugly, silent sobs, her carefully applied makeup a lost cause. Julian remained unnervingly still, a hollowed-out man, a statue of defeat. He had lost. He had lost the money, he had lost the argument, and most importantly, he had lost his story. He was no longer the tragic artist, the misunderstood genius. The court and the world had seen him for what he was, a petty, vindictive failure. Eleanor watched them for a moment, and what she felt was not the hot, triumphant flush of victory. It was a profound, bone-deep weariness, followed by the slow, creeping relief of a fever finally breaking. It was the feeling she recognized from the end of a long and difficult surgery, not joy, but the quiet, grim satisfaction of a necessary and painful job well done. The tumor had been excised. The patient would survive. Before she left the courtroom, guided by Carter's steadying hand on her arm, she allowed her gaze to fall on Julian one last time. The burning hatred she had once felt for him was gone, replaced by something far colder and more desolate, pity. She saw him not as a monster, but as a small, pathetic creature, so terrified of his own insignificance that he had to try and burn down her world just to feel the warmth of a flame. He had sought to destroy her, but in the end, he had only revealed the utter emptiness of his own soul. Justice, she realized in that moment, did not feel like a prize. It felt like a restoration, a painful, laborious setting of the bone back into its proper place. The verdict was not a whisper, it was a thunderclap that echoed across the digital landscape where the war had been waged. The justice system, often seen as a slow, analog relic, delivered its final, devastating blow, using the enemy's own weapons. The first consequence, and perhaps the most poetic, was the court-ordered apology. The blog, which had once been a platform for Julian's venomous fiction, now hosted a single, stark post. The text was dry, legalistic, and stripped of all emotion, its words approved by the court. It was a sterile confession, a forced retraction of every lie, a public monument to their defeat. Chloe, the self-proclaimed master of social media, was forced to pin this same apology to the top of her own profiles. Her curated world of aesthetic perfection, of artisanal lattes and sunset yoga poses, was now permanently scarred by this banner of her own ugliness. The internet, a creature of boundless schadenfreude, responded with predictable glee. The apology went viral, far more so than the original lies. It was screenshotted, shared, and turned into a meme. The comments section, once a cesspool of manufactured outrage directed at Eleanor, became a digital pillory for Julian and Chloe. They were mocked, ridiculed, and condemned by the same faceless mob they had once so expertly manipulated. Julian, who had craved the spotlight, was finally the subject of a global conversation, but the topic was his spectacular, humiliating downfall. Chloe, the brand strategist, had successfully executed her masterpiece of brand destruction her own. The digital humiliation was swiftly followed by a real-world collapse. The tendrils of their carefully constructed lives began to wither and die. Chloe's email inbox, once flooded with partnership offers, now filled with polite but firm terminations. Brands whose values were built on authenticity and positivity could not afford to be associated with her calculated malice. Her career, a fragile ecosystem built on likes and influence, suffered a mass extinction event. For Julian, the reckoning was quieter, but no less absolute. His literary agent called, his voice laced with an uncomfortable formality. The publisher who had been intrigued by the human drama of his story was no longer interested. The tragedy he had tried to sell was now his own, and it turned out to be a story no one wanted to buy. Their relationship, a toxic alliance forged in a shared crucible of resentment, could not survive the crushing weight of their failure. The shared enemy that had united them was gone, replaced by a mountain of debt and a future of public disgrace. The end came not with a dramatic explosion, but with a series of ugly, bitter arguments in their overpriced apartment. He blamed her for the text messages, the digital lipstick on her collar. She blamed him for his pathetic, predictable outburst in court. They turned their venom on each other, two scorpions in a bottle, until there was nothing left but the shared, poisonous knowledge that they had ruined their lives for nothing. Chloe packed her bags a week later, leaving Julian alone amidst the wreckage of their shared ambition. Even the quiet, manicured world of Margaret Croft was not immune to the fallout. The verdict was reported in the local paper, a small article that was nonetheless read by everyone in her social circle. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public condemnations. There was only a quiet, creeping isolation. The invitations to dinner parties stopped arriving. Her weekly bridge game was mysteriously rescheduled without her. The polite smiles from her neighbors at the country club were now tinged with a cold, unmistakable judgment. She had not broken the law, but she had committed a far greater sin in the court of her community's opinion. She had enabled and defended a monstrous cruelty. Her perfect home, her shrine to her son, became her prison, where she was left alone with the framed photographs of a man who was now a pariah. In stark contrast to their noisy, spectacular collapse, Eleanor's restoration was a quiet, gradual dawn. Her first day back at Parkside Hospital was a study in understated redemption. She walked down the same long, sterile corridors where she had once felt the sting of averted eyes and sudden silences. But today, the atmosphere was different. The whispers were gone. The averted eyes were replaced with direct looks of profound, unadulterated respect. Nurses and orderlies, people she had known for years, would stop what they were doing to offer a simple, heartfelt, "Welcome back, Doctor." The chief of surgery, Dr. Thorne, who had delivered the news of her suspension, met her in his office. There was no corporate doublespeak this time. He looked her in the eye and offered a sincere, humble apology for the hospital's failure to stand by her. "We let the noise of the mob drown out what we knew to be true," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "You are the finest surgeon on this staff, Eleanor. It is an honor to have you back." But Eleanor had not returned unchanged. The ordeal had left an indelible mark, a digital scar on her soul. She was stronger, yes, but she was also warier, her trust in the world's inherent goodness irrevocably fractured. The easy openness she once had was replaced by a more reserved, private demeanor. She was still a brilliant and compassionate doctor to her patients, but she held a part of herself back from the world now. The scar was a reminder of her vulnerability, a permanent lesson in the anatomy of betrayal. She knew she could not simply erase the past year, nor did she want to. The pain had to have a purpose. A portion of the massive settlement was set aside, not for a new home or a lavish vacation, but for a new beginning. She established a small, private foundation, a legal defense fund named the Veritas Project. Its mission was simple: to provide financial and legal support for victims of online defamation and character assassination, for the people who could not afford a Benjamin Carter, for those who were being silenced and destroyed by lies they had no power to fight. She was transforming her personal trauma into a public shield. It was the ultimate act of reclaiming her narrative, not by erasing the wound, but by using the scar tissue to build something new and unbreakable. The surgeon, true to her nature, was taking the worst of all things and finding a way to heal not just herself, but others. The world, for her, was once again a place of order and purpose, not because the chaos had disappeared, but because she had learned how to create her own. The seasons turned, and the raw, gaping wound of the trial slowly began to heal into a scar. Life for Eleanor found a new rhythm, quieter and more deliberate than before. She poured herself back into her work at the hospital, her hands as steady as ever, her focus absolute. The Veritas Project, her small foundation, began to take on its first cases, offering a lifeline to others caught in the crosscurrents of digital hate. The public apology from Julian and Chloe faded from the top of their social media feeds, eventually buried under the relentless churn of new outrages and fresh dramas. The world, as it always does, moved on. Eleanor believed she had too. She had received the verdict, the vindication, the financial settlement. She had, she thought, achieved closure. But the universe had one final, chilling postscript to deliver. It arrived on a crisp autumn evening, 6 months after the trial had ended. A small, square cardboard box left on her doorstep, with no return address and her name printed in unfamiliar block letters. Her first reaction was a jolt of cold fear, a primal reflex from a time when any unexpected communication felt like a threat. She carried it inside, her heart beating a little faster, and let it sit on her kitchen counter for a full hour before she dared to open it. Inside, nestled in a bed of tissue paper, was a single object, a worn, black leather, bound journal. She recognized it instantly. It was Julian's, from the very beginning of their marriage, a period she had once thought of as their happiest, a relic from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. There was no note, no explanation. She didn't know who had sent it, a cleaning service, clearing out his abandoned apartment, perhaps, or even Margaret, in a final, inscrutable act. Part of her wanted to throw it away, to burn it, to refuse to let the ghost of that life back into her home. But the surgeon in her, the part that needed to understand the root cause of any pathology, could not resist. This was the one piece of the story she didn't have, the beginning, in his own words. Later that night, with a glass of wine by her side, she sat down and began to read. The early entries were filled with a familiar, almost painful nostalgia. They were the words of the man she had fallen in love with, witty, passionate, and full of adoration for her. He wrote about her intelligence, her drive, her compassion. It was the story she had always told herself. But as she read deeper, into the second year of their marriage, a subtle, dark thread began to appear. It was long before her first major promotion, long before the awards and the recognition, back when she was just a resident, working impossibly long hours for very little pay. A different kind of resentment began to surface in his elegant script. She found the entry that changed everything, written on a Tuesday night after she had come home and fallen into an exhausted sleep after a 36-hour shift. He had not been angry that night. He had been something far worse. "She is asleep," he wrote. "She smells of antiseptic and the hospital's stale coffee. And I hate her for it. Not for the smell or for the exhaustion. I hate her because her exhaustion has a purpose. She came home tonight and told me, with that quiet light in her eyes, that she spent 12 hours in surgery helping to reconstruct the heart of a baby born with its aorta on the wrong side. She was tired, but she was full. Her life has a meaning that can be held in her hands. I spent my day staring at a blank page. The silence of this apartment was my operating theater, and my patient was my own inadequacy, and I could not save it. Her hands create life and order and hope. My hands feel empty. It is not her future success I dread. It is her present meaning that I cannot bear. It is a mirror, and I hate the man I see in it." Eleanor put the journal down, a cold, profound clarity washing over her. It was the final, devastating diagnosis. The entire narrative, the one she had believed, the one Carter had so brilliantly argued in court, was incomplete. Julian's rage was not a reaction to her success, to her fame, to her money. That had all been fuel, yes, but it had not been the spark. The spark was his own emptiness. His resentment was a pre-existing condition, a cancer of the soul that had been festering long before she had accomplished anything the world deemed worthy of envy. Her light hadn't blinded him. It had only illuminated the darkness that was already there. His war against her was never about bringing her down to his level. It was a desperate, savage attempt to destroy the mirror that showed him his own hollow reflection. It was not her fault, none of it. It was never about her at all. This final truth was a strange and terrible gift. It didn't lessen the pain of what he had done, but it recontextualized it into something almost pitiable. The anger she held finally, fully, dissolved, leaving behind only a great, sad emptiness. He was a black hole, and she had simply been the nearest star. She closed the journal and placed it in a box at the back of her closet. She would not destroy it. It was a case file, a final report on a sickness for which there was no cure. It was a testament to a chilling, universal truth she now understood in her very bones. That often, the most vicious attacks we endure from others are not a reflection of our worth, but a screaming confession of their own. And it served as a permanent reminder of the most important lesson she had learned in the crucible of a digital fire. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured too much. For in that silence, they are not breaking, they are reloading.